June 18, 1944. Normandy, a few miles south of Saint-Lô. The morning haze still clung to the hedgerows like pale smoke when Thomas Hale, an American liaison officer attached to an interrogation unit, stepped into another makeshift tent where two freshly captured German grenadiers waited under guard. The air smelled of damp earth, cordite drifting from distant skirmishes, and the bitter reek of burned farms still smoldering in the hollows behind the lines. Hale had already questioned 6 prisoners since dawn, and each time he heard the same uneasy refrain repeated with subtle variations. Fear layered beneath fatigue, eyes flicking upward at sounds far too distant for an average soldier to notice. They were afraid of something specific, something they all named in low voices the moment they realized the Americans offered water instead of cruelty. The first grenadier, barely more than a boy, wiped mud from his lips with trembling fingers. Hale watched him closely, noticing how he stiffened whenever the soft, mosquito-like buzz of an aircraft drifted overhead. Not a fighter, not a bomber, just the tiny, high-pitched hum of an L-4 observation plane circling somewhere beyond the hedgerow line. The boy's reaction was instant. Shoulders tightened, breath shortened, his gaze locked on the canvas roof as if expecting death to punch through it. Hale saw this same reflex now in almost every prisoner brought in after action. As soon as that fragile little aircraft appeared, they behaved as though artillery shells were already inbound. Across the table, the second prisoner, older, gaunt, with grime worked permanently into the creases of his skin, leaned forward and whispered, "It is always the guns. Not the tanks, not your thunderbolts. It is the guns." He spoke with the weary certainty of someone who had survived too many barrages to pretend otherwise. Hale pressed gently, asking what exactly terrified them. The answer came in a rush. American artillery that arrived within minutes, sometimes seconds, as if the shells were stored in the next field. Fire that adjusted with uncanny speed. Explosions that crept toward them across the hedgerows with mathematical precision until there was no cover left to hide behind. The man's hands shook as he explained how his company moved only at night now, in scattered groups, never bunched together long enough to make a visible target. Even cooking fires were forbidden. They lived like hunted animals. Hale listened, taking notes, understanding that the fear itself had become a weapon. He knew the American guns weren't the heaviest in Europe, nor the farthest reaching. The Germans had the famous 88s, the Nebelwerfers that screamed like demons, batteries capable of saturating fields in an instant. But something had changed in 1944, something that made ordinary American field guns feel omnipresent. The prisoners repeated it again and again. It wasn't the guns, it was the speed. The uncanny quickness with which American crews found a target, calculated the firing solution, and unleashed a storm before the Germans even realized they had been spotted. A shelling that behaved more like coordinated punishment than random destruction. Outside the tent, the L-4 buzzed closer, circling lazily, barely visible above the hedgerows. Hale saw both prisoners flinch, their shoulders rising as though bracing for impact. They had learned what that sound meant, that somewhere beyond the tree line, American artillery officers were already drawing lines on laminated maps, calling coordinates, preparing to collapse fire from multiple batteries onto a single point. The tiny airplane was not a threat itself, it was a herald, a signal that survival depended not on courage, but on luck, measured in thin seconds. Hale stepped out of the tent, the wind warm with the scent of crushed foliage. As he watched the L-4 perform another slow arc over the valley, he understood what the German soldiers had sensed long before American officers articulated it. The hedgerows hid not chaos, but method, a system that made artillery feel alive, responsive, omnipresent. And in the coming weeks, as the battles intensified and the front shifted eastward into Belgium, he would see that the fear etched on the faces of the prisoners was only the surface of something deeper, something built long before Normandy. A question formed slowly in his mind, a question whose answer would lead him into the heart of the American artillery system, a machine more intricate than any outsider had imagined. And he sensed that uncovering that system would explain why German morale was beginning to crack in places where no infantry assault had yet occurred.
Thomas Hale stood over a cluttered field table in a forward command post near Carentan, listening to the steady murmur of radios that never seemed to fall silent anymore. Outside, the hedgerows trembled from distant detonations, each one a muffled punctuation in the damp June air. The night was humid, heavy with the smell of churned earth and hot metal. But inside the tent, everything felt strangely focused, like the eye of a storm. Hale watched officers move between maps, plotting sheets, range tables, and radio men hunched over their sets with an intensity that bordered on ritual. It was there, in that dimly lit labyrinth of grease pencils and overlapping grids, that he first truly grasped the secret behind the fear German prisoners had confessed. It wasn't just the guns. It was the machine behind the guns. On a massive table illuminated by a rattling lantern, Hale studied the highly standardized American firing maps, each one printed with precise grids, uniform symbols, and contour lines that matched every other map used across Normandy. An artillery captain explained how every battery, regardless of division, used the same coordinate system. That meant any battalion could support any infantry unit without confusion, without replotting terrain, without wasting time. Hale traced his finger across the surface, seeing how the grids overlapped like an immense net cast across the French countryside. Every square inch was catalogued, measured, ready to be struck without hesitation. He watched as a forward observer's call came in, calm, brief, almost routine. A grid number, a target description, a request for fire. Immediately the tent awakened. A sergeant in the fire direction center leaned over a plotting board, sliding metal rulers with the practiced grace of a pianist, calculating deflection and quadrant within seconds. Another man checked weather corrections, wind drift adjustments, powder lot variations. The calculations were not done at each gun. They were done here, centrally, in a battalion-level brain that unified all firing elements under a single will. Then the coordinates were relayed outward like a command from a nervous system. Within moments, all 12 guns of the battalion fired, as if they shared one mind. Outside, the night rippled with synchronized thunder. Hale felt the air tremble against his ribs. The responding explosions rolled across the hedgerows with terrifying punctuality. The captain looked at him and said quietly, almost apologetically, "This is why they fear us. We don't fire as batteries. We fire as organisms." Hale saw it now clearly. This was an artillery doctrine designed not for dramatic barrages, but for speed. Speed that rendered cover meaningless and movement suicidal. Even more astounding was the ability to mass fire without physically massing guns. Through radio coordination, scattered batteries could be concentrated onto a single target, creating the illusion of a giant, invisible cannon that could appear anywhere on the battlefield. Hale imagined being a German soldier in a hedgerow, believing he had escaped detection, only to hear one L4 circling above, and then, minutes later, the impossible. Dozens of shells from guns he could not see, guns he did not know existed, guns belonging to units several miles apart, but firing as one. And this doctrine wasn't new. Hale learned that the structure, the fire direction centers, the standardized procedures, the meticulous training had been refined for decades, all leading toward this moment when the U.S. Army would rely on artillery more than any other weapon in its arsenal. The Germans still fired battery by battery, each officer calculating his own data in isolation. The Americans had turned their artillery into a single coordinated intellect. It was the difference between scattered fists and a single crushing blow. As Hale stepped outside into the night, the echoes still rolling like distant waves, he realized that the American system was not just superior, it was something unprecedented in modern warfare. A framework built long before Normandy, now revealing its true strength across the burned hollows and shattered hedgerows of France. And he sensed that the deeper he followed this thread, the more he would uncover a revolution hidden beneath the war's surface. A revolution crafted not on the battlefield, but in the classrooms and proving grounds of an earlier America. He had to understand who started it, who had built this machine long before the first shell fell on Europe, because he suspected the origins of it would explain why the fear in German eyes ran deeper than anything a single battle could produce.
Thomas Hale found himself transported far from the hedgerows of Normandy as he sifted through the thick folders sent from headquarters, documents filled with names, dates, and training reports from Fort Sill, Oklahoma. He sat in a dimly lit requisition hut outside St. Lo, its canvas walls fluttering softly with each distant concussion of the ongoing battles. Rain tapped faint patterns against the roof while the kerosene lamp flickered, casting uncertain shadows over the papers sprawled before him. In those quiet moments, Hale realized that what he was reading was not merely training doctrine. It was the blueprint of an entire transformation, one crafted long before the American guns began tearing open the French countryside. He read the names again: Brewer, Ward, Burns. Officers whose contributions rarely appeared in dramatic war narratives, yet whose ideas were now killing more German soldiers than tanks or bombers ever could. Hale imagined them decades earlier, middle-aged men in dusty uniforms, pacing the chalk-lined floors of Fort Sill's classrooms, scribbling formulas on blackboards as young artillery officers watched in polite confusion. None of them could have foreseen that their theories would one day become the nervous system of the most feared artillery arm in Europe. Brewer had revolutionized the way American units understood terrain. He insisted that artillerymen learn to visualize every undulation of earth, not as an obstacle, but as a predictable variable, something that could be measured, charted, and turned into mathematical advantage. Ward, a meticulous man by reputation, created surveying techniques so precise that artillery battalions could establish firing positions almost blindly and still hit within tens of yards on the first adjustment. Burns, whose sharp handwriting filled entire notebooks with experimentation results, pioneered the idea of centralized fire control, arguing that the guns themselves should never calculate anything if it could be done quicker and more consistently elsewhere. As Hale read through their work, he saw the early seeds of a doctrine that would later terrify thousands. The graphic firing table, sketched on paper in the early 1930s, appeared almost innocent in its simplicity. Graphs that allowed firing data to be found in seconds instead of minutes. But Hale understood the consequence. It meant life or death. It meant that a German patrol spotted at the edge of a field could be obliterated before their commander even finished shouting an order to disperse. He pictured those interwar officers experimenting under the relentless Oklahoma sun, setting up mock firing centers in rattling wooden huts, arguing over computation methods, testing new procedures late into the night, their only audience the cicadas humming in the heat. These men, Hale realized, had shaped a system long before they had a war to test it in. The French campaign of 1940 had collapsed before American observers could learn much. But these forgotten pioneers at Fort Sill had persisted, perfecting something the U.S. Army barely noticed until the global conflict forced their theories into action. And now, in the humid gloom of a French evening, Hale could trace the line from those chalk-covered classrooms to the stunned expressions of German prisoners who whispered about artillery that moved like lightning. The connection was unmistakable. The American fire control miracle of 1944 had been born in the quiet monotony of peace. A gust of wind pushed aside the tent flap, carrying with it the damp smell of rain and burned timber from a shattered farmhouse nearby. Hale leaned back, listening to the distant crack of another coordinated barrage. He realized then that these men, Brewer, Ward, Burns, had never seen what their ideas would do to human bodies, to bunkers cracked open like eggs, to forests shredded into splinters. They had engineered a system for efficiency without ever imagining how devastatingly effective it would become when amplified by war's urgency. He gathered the papers and tucked them back into the worn folder, but the ghost of Fort Sill stayed with him. The rain intensified outside, drumming steadily as if marking time. Hale stepped out into the muddy darkness, understanding that the revolution was not born in Normandy. It had merely matured there. The true origins lay in American minds that had spent years building a machine no enemy was prepared for. And as Hale gazed toward the front, where flashes lit the horizon through the falling rain, he sensed that the next revelation would not be found in old documents or dusty classrooms, but above the battlefield itself, hovering in the fragile wings of the tiny aircraft that turned secrecy into certainty and transformed fear into inevitability.
The morning mist clung stubbornly to the fields east of Saint-Lô when Thomas Hale paused on a rise overlooking the patchwork of hedgerows below. The ground was still wet from a night of short, violent rain, and the air carried the sharp scent of wet grass mixed with distant smoke. He heard it first before he saw it, a faint, insect-like buzz drifting lazily across the valley. It was a sound he had grown accustomed to in recent weeks, yet every time it appeared, the tension in the German prisoners surged like an electric current. Hale lifted his binoculars, searching the pale sky, until the tiny figure of an L4 cub finally emerged from the thinning mist, its wings glinting weakly in the early sun. The aircraft looked almost comically fragile, a slow-moving, fabric-covered speck drifting just above treetop height. Yet the longer Hale watched it circle, dipping occasionally as if smelling the earth for danger, the more he understood why German soldiers reacted with such raw dread. The L4 was small, but it was omniscient. Wherever it glided, American artillery followed. Below, an infantry platoon moved through the hedgerows cautiously. The Cub adjusted its orbit with the slightest tilt, its pilot leaning sideways in the cramped cockpit to survey the ground while the artillery observer beside him scribbled notes marking enemy foxholes, camouflaged gun nests, even the faint trails left by retreating German troops. Hale watched as the observer keyed his radio, speaking in calm, clipped bursts, no different from the tone he'd heard in the fire direction tent. This was the ritual that turned fear into certainty. The observer's voice, steady, precise, traveled through the battalion network, and almost instantly, the invisible machine of American artillery responded. Minutes later, the stillness shattered. A sequence of sharp detonations rolled across the valley like the opening chords of a violent symphony. The hedgerow that had moments earlier seemed harmless erupted in flame and soil fragments, the explosions walking methodically across the line of brush. Hale felt the concussions thump against his chest, even from the ridge. He lowered the binoculars just long enough to steady himself. When he raised them again, he saw German figures scrambling desperately from their holes, scattering like startled birds. The L4 dipped once, almost sympathetically, and then another set of rounds crashed down, turning their escape into a deadly geometry of fire and panic. Hale had seen the reports, German units freezing in place at the first sign of an L4, men refusing to move even when retreat meant survival, fear chaining them to the earth. Officers wrote about the paralysis spreading through their ranks, about soldiers who confessed that once the Cub appeared, they felt as though the battle was already lost. Hale understood it now. The Germans were not afraid of the airplane. They were afraid of what it summoned. 3 minutes. That was all it took between detection and destruction. No bunker, no hedgerow, no hurried camouflage could outpace the speed of American coordination. He continued watching as the L4 banked away from the valley, its observer likely already plotting a new grid for another battery. The little aircraft skimmed so low that Hale could almost imagine the pilot dragging a hand across the tops of the apple trees. Its slowness was its strength. It could read the battlefield like a book, page by page, line by line. It could loiter where fighters dared not linger, sipping fuel, floating on soft thermals, invisible to everything except terrified eyes below. By midday, the sky brightened fully, and the Cub returned for another pattern, its shadow crawling slowly across the ground like a thin omen. Hale noticed how American infantry behaved around it, relaxed, reassured, even emboldened. They knew that once the L4 appeared, the landscape ahead would be softened, broken, cleared before they advanced. For the Germans, it meant something else entirely. The sudden realization that concealment was dead, that the battlefield itself had turned traitor. As Hale walked down from the ridge, the Cub's engine fading behind him, he understood that this tiny aircraft had become one of the war's most decisive tools, not for its power, but for its vision. It stripped away the last advantage the Germans had held in Normandy, the ability to hide. And Hale knew that what he had witnessed here was only the surface of a much larger truth. The L4 was one eye of the system. The other, equally deadly, lay in the American supply lines that fed those guns with a volume and mobility no enemy army could hope to match. He sensed that the next step in his journey would lead him from the sky's fragile watchers back to the earth, to the rumbling columns of trucks and tractors and self-propelled guns that turned American artillery not just into the fastest force in Europe, but into the loudest.
The road east of Coutances vibrated under the weight of steel and engines as Thomas Hale traveled with a supply convoy inching toward the forward batteries. Dust hung thick in the humid afternoon air, rising in lazy clouds behind the endless line of trucks, prime movers, and self-propelled guns that crawled along the winding Norman lanes. The smell of hot oil, fuel, and sun-baked canvas fused with the distant undertone of explosions. Steady, rhythmic, a deep pulse that never quite faded. Hale sat wedged between crates of ammunition, watching the procession like a river of metal flowing toward the front. And he realized he was witnessing the other half of the American artillery miracle, the raw industrial muscle that made the lightning-fast barrages possible. All around him, vehicles roared forward. GMC trucks stacked with shells, M4 tractors dragging 155mm howitzers like weary giants, and behind them the squat, powerful shapes of M7 priests clattering over the rough road. Nothing about the scene looked elegant. It wasn't meant to. It was designed to move, faster, farther, and more often than any artillery force the Germans had imagined. Hale looked back at the procession stretching over the hills and understood the truth. Mobility was force. Mobility was destruction. Mobility, in 1944, was victory. A sergeant riding beside him shouted over the engine noise, explaining how the German batteries, the ones the Allies once feared, still relied heavily on horses. Hale had heard the statistics, but seeing this American column brought the contrast into painful clarity. Horse-drawn artillery could not outrun motorized guns. It couldn't redeploy in minutes. It couldn't survive a sudden counter-battery storm. German gunners moved slowly, hiding in forests and waiting for nightfall just to shift positions that Americans moved between over the course of a single hour. Hale watched a priest roll off the roadway into a field, its crew leaping down to prepare a fire mission, and felt the weight of that advantage settle on him like a revelation. He followed the gun crew as they set up. They worked with a speed that bordered on choreography. Trails dug in, elevations set, shells lined in neat rows, fuses checked. Within minutes, the priest's gun thundered, its recoil shuddering through Hale's boots. The crew worked in a blur, feeding the cannon, adjusting, firing again.
Behind them, other guns opened up, 105s, 155s, even heavier pieces further rearward, each one feeding from the same logistical artery, each one part of a vast consuming machine made possible by American industry. Hale knew that while the Germans struggled to transport a dozen shells per horse team, the U.S. Army moved thousands per hour. And then there was the new weapon the sergeant pointed out with grim pride, a box of small, innocent-looking cylinders being fitted to incoming shells, the proximity fuse. Hale watched his gunners arm shells with the device that had changed the battlefield in mere weeks. Instead of burying itself uselessly in soft earth, a shell with a proximity fuse detonated in the air, scattering deadly fragments downward in a wide umbrella of destruction. German soldiers caught in the open stood no chance. Even those huddled in foxholes felt the storm of steel raining vertically. Hale had spoken to prisoners who described the experience with haunted voices, claiming the air itself had turned violent. He saw a demonstration later that afternoon. A battery fired across a valley at a mocked-up German position. The shells burst above the target in perfect sequence, sharp, bright flashes suspending death in the air before raining fragments across the churned ground. Hale felt the shockwave roll toward him like a breath from a furnace. It was precise, merciless, and mechanically inevitable, requiring almost no adjustment once the fuses were calibrated. The Germans, who once prided themselves on technical innovation, could not match this. Their counter-battery fire grew increasingly hesitant, their movements increasingly frantic, their daylight operations nearly extinct. As the last echoes faded, Hale regarded the American column once more. Trucks refueling, crews eating hurried rations, mechanics working beneath vehicles already coated with dust. It was not glamorous. It was not heroic in the way infantry charges or tank duels were romanticized, but it was relentless. It was a flood the Germans could never dam. He understood now why the enemy spoke of hopelessness when discussing American artillery. It was not only the speed of fire, nor the observation plans, nor the centralized calculations. It was the sheer physical inevitability of it all. Once the Americans committed artillery to a sector, they brought more shells, more guns, more mobility, and more innovation than the Wehrmacht had the capacity to resist. Hale climbed back into the truck as the convoy lurched forward again, its axles groaning under the weight of thousands of pounds of ammunition. The road to the front shimmered in the lowering sun, and ahead the horizon pulsed with steady flashes. The guns were already at work. And Hale sensed that their full impact, on battle after battle, ridge after ridge, was building toward a final crushing realization. The Germans were no longer fighting an army. They were fighting a system.
Autumn rains swept across the Ardennes in thin gray sheets when Thomas Hale reached the remnants of what had once been a German defensive line near Elsenborn Ridge. The wind carried the metallic scent of soaked earth and spent propellant, and the ground was gouged by so many overlapping shell craters that the landscape seemed less like a battlefield and more like the surface of some scarred, broken planet. Hale stood silently on the ridge's crest, the hood of his raincoat fluttering, listening to the distant hum of supply trucks farther west. The war had shifted eastward now, but the echoes of the artillery that had defended this ridge still clung to the air like ghostly residue. He looked over the terrain and tried to imagine the scene months earlier, December 1944, when the German offensive had crashed into American lines with the desperation of a cornered animal. The bulge had opened like a knife wound, splitting units, crushing positions, sending thousands reeling backward in confusion. And yet here, on Elsenborn Ridge, something extraordinary had happened. Hale had read the after-action reports, American units refusing to yield, holding fast not through numbers or armor, but through the ceaseless support of artillery that fired with such intensity, such unity, that attackers described the ridge as a wall of fire. He walked down toward the forests where the German 12th SS Panzer Division had attempted assault after assault, only to be torn apart by barrages that landed with almost metronomic precision. Survivors later confessed that every time they regrouped, fresh shells rained down before they could even raise their heads.
Hale imagined the panic, the disorientation, the way the Americans had called in fire from every available gun, division, corps, even army-level artillery, massing power in a way no European army had ever achieved. It was the purest expression of the doctrine he had spent months studying: decentralized guns, centralized control, perfect communication. From Elsenborn, he traveled south to the shattered remnants of the Martelange Road, where American batteries had stalled German armor with rapid, punishing fire that chewed through the columns before they could break out. He then journeyed to the fields around Hill 192 near Saint-Lô, walking the same narrow approaches where U.S. observers had turned German positions into exposed targets through relentless coordination with the guns behind them. The same story repeated in Martin, where German panzers attempting a dramatic counterattack found themselves trapped in a valley of rolling destruction, artillery responding faster than armor could maneuver, turning steel vehicles into flickering pyres. At Bastogne, Hale stood in the cold among the battered foxholes, still etched into the frozen soil. Here, American artillery had fired until paint blistered from gun barrels, until crews worked by instinct alone, until truckloads slid across icy roads like lifelines thrown through darkness. The German encirclement had tightened ruthlessly, but the artillery, always the artillery, broke every push, shattered every approach, bought the 101st time until the relief columns arrived. Officers from both sides later admitted that without the artillery ring protecting Bastogne, the town would have fallen in days. Hale felt it in all these places, a kind of invisible architecture binding the battlefield, a structure built not of stone or steel, but of coordination, calculation, and relentless logistical power. American artillery didn't just support the infantry, it shaped the battlefield itself, sculpting victory through repetition, speed, and overwhelming accuracy. And now, walking through these silent valleys, months after the guns had fallen quiet, Hale sensed the enormity of what he had uncovered. The Germans had not been defeated by a single weapon or a single innovation. They had been defeated by a system, a living, breathing organism of observation planes, fire direction centers, motorized supply lines, standardized maps, and fearless forward observers who crawled to the edge of devastation to direct destruction with cold precision. A system so flexible that scattered guns behaved like one, so fast that hiding became meaningless, so powerful that resistance eventually turned into resignation. Hale crouched beside a crater still filled with rainwater, watching ripples distort his reflection. He wondered how many decisions, how many calculations, how many maps and theories and quiet training sessions at Fort Sill had culminated here, in battlefields where the enemy's will had simply broken. The aftermath felt strangely peaceful, yet beneath that peace lay the knowledge that thousands of shells had fallen to create it. As he stood and turned back toward the road, the wind lifted again, carrying with it the faint rumble of distant guns still being tested somewhere behind the new front. For a moment, Hale imagined he could hear the full system come alive once more, the L4 circling, the radios crackling, the fire direction centers buzzing, the trucks rolling, the guns aligning in perfect unity. And he understood at last that America had not won these battles with superior bravery or singular genius, but with a machine of their own creation, precise, responsive, unified, unmatched by any army in Europe, a system that did not simply support war, a system that decided it.